The morning she found the inventory list in her father-in-law's old writing desk, Cordelia did not send it back to London. She smoothed the creased page flat on the ledger table and read the line in a clerk's careful hand: Ashby Diamonds, removed to town for the use of Mrs. Vivienne Colworth, by order of His Grace the Duke of Wexmoor, her own husband's name, beneath her own husband's seal, releasing his family's diamonds to another woman's throat. She folded the page once, precisely, into the back of her own account book instead of the fire. There were exactly 11 days before the quarter closed and Thistlewood's profits would be recorded for the first time in the estate's history. She did not yet know what that folded page would cost her. Had she known, she would have kept it all the same. The morning the solicitor's letter arrived confirming the tax assessment, Cordelia did not go to the window to watch for the coach that would inevitably follow it. She broke the wax seal, read the letter twice, and set it beside the household accounts, because the household accounts were due, and because there were exactly 18 months since she had last received a letter from London that was not a banker's draft. She did not yet know what the assessment would cost her. Had she known, she would have opened it all the same. Thistlewood Grange had been her domain for 18 months. The Duke of Wexmoor, her husband, by contract, and by law, and by almost nothing else, had installed her there the week after the wedding and returned south, where a woman named Vivienne Colworth occupied the finest rooms of the London townhouse, wore the Ashby diamonds to every event that mattered, and wanted for nothing that money could still purchase. Cordelia had received a banker's draft for household maintenance and a letter of 4 sentences. It informed her that the land agent would call quarterly, that the household staff was not to exceed 8, and that her husband trusted she would manage within her means. She had read it once, filed it, and gone to inspect the granary, which was empty, the roof of which leaked in 11 places, and the ledgers of which had not been balanced in 4 years. She was the daughter of a man who had gone bankrupt twice and rebuilt twice, and she had watched both collapses closely enough to understand that ruin was rarely a single catastrophe. It was a slow accumulation of small neglects, the sort that looked like nothing at all until the day the sum of them arrived at your door with a writ. Her father had taught her, without meaning to teach her anything, that the difference between a man who recovered and a man who did not was not fortune. It was attention. She had brought that lesson to Thistlewood the way another woman might have brought linens, and she had not stopped applying it since. The granary was full now. She had renegotiated the wool contracts in her first autumn, replacing a single indifferent broker with 3 competing buyers, and the difference had gone straight into repairs no one in London had authorized and no one in London had noticed. The mortgage that had shadowed the estate for a decade was gone, cleared 11 months ago through the sale of a hunting lodge so long forgotten that the solicitor's own records had misplaced its deed. 23 tenant families paid their rent now, on time, in coin rather than excuses, because she had gone to each of them personally in that first difficult winter and asked not what they owed but what they needed, and had found, more often than not, that the two were the same question asked from opposite ends. None of it had been announced. She had not written to London to report it, because no one in London had asked, and because there was a particular satisfaction, she admitted this to herself only in the quiet hour before sleep, in building something that belonged entirely to her, unwitnessed, unclaimed by anyone else's name. It was Mr. Aldous Fenn, the land agent, who brought the first sign that the silence was about to end. He came to the kitchen door on a Tuesday in late October, hat in both hands, wearing the particular stillness of a man delivering news he has rehearsed and still does not trust himself to deliver well. Cordelia was at the accounts table, where she was most mornings, the ledger open before her, ink drying on her second finger in the manner it always did by 10 o'clock. "There's a rider come from London," he said. "Solicitor's man. He's at the inn." "Asking what?" "Questions I didn't like the shape of." Fenn turned his hat once in his hands. "About the accounts. Wanted to know who'd authorized the sale of the lodge. Wanted to know why the assessment this year shows Thistlewood turning a profit larger than the London house." He paused. "Larger than the London house, my lady." He said that twice, like he thought I'd misheard him the first time. Cordelia set down her pen with the particular care she brought to setting down anything she did not wish to drop. And what did you tell him? Told him the truth. That you'd kept every receipt, every contract, every wage ledger since the day you arrived, and that he was welcome to examine the lot of them at his leisure. Fenn's mouth did something that was not quite a smile, the expression of a man who has spent 18 months quietly admiring a thing he was never asked to admire aloud. He didn't much care for that answer. Men like that rarely do. They want a villain, not a filing system. She let this settle. A solicitor's man did not ride for days into the country to ask idle questions about a hunting lodge nobody had missed. Something in London had moved, or someone had, and whatever it was had been moving for longer than a single letter's worth of time. She thought, briefly and without wanting to, of the day the Ashby diamonds had left Thistlewood, not that she had seen it happen. She had not been mistress of the house yet, had not even been married a full fortnight, but she had found the inventory record months later in her father-in-law's old writing desk, the ink faded but the lines still legible, removed to town for the use of Mrs. Vivian Colworth, by order of His Grace. She had folded that page and kept it rather than burned it, for reasons she had not fully examined even to herself, and it lived now in the back of her own accounts book, beneath records that were entirely, unimpeachably hers. She had learned of Mrs. Colworth's existence the way she had learned most things about her marriage, sideways, from servants who assumed she already knew, or from the careful omissions in her husband's rare correspondence. The wedding itself she remembered with unusual clarity, a contract dressed as a ceremony, her father's relief visible even through his grief at what the marriage cost him in pride, the Duke's face arranged into the correct expression for the correct number of minutes and no longer. 3 sentences, 4 days later, had told her where she was to live and how she was to conduct herself. Nothing in those sentences had mentioned that another woman would occupy the rooms Cordelia herself had never been shown. She had not wept over it for more than a single evening. She had, instead, gone to inspect the granary. "There's more," Fenn said, and something in his voice made her look up fully. "The rider left this morning, back for London. But before he went, he let slip, I don't think he meant to, he'd had 2 pints more than he ought, that his master wasn't sending a report back to the Duke. His master was bringing the Duke himself. North. Within the fortnight." The ink on her second finger had gone from wet to dry sometime in the last quarter hour, and she noticed this the way she noticed most things when she needed a fact to hold on to that was not the fact currently in front of her. "Within the fortnight," she repeated. "That's what he said, my lady." 18 months of silence, and now a fortnight's warning that it was ending. She thought of the granary, full for the first time in a decade. She thought of the tenant cottages, every one of them occupied, every rent paid. She thought of the mortgage, cleared, and the wool contracts, renegotiated, and the still-room remedy she'd taught herself from her grandmother's old receipts, dispensed to half the village without charge, which was perhaps why Mrs. Ivy Hallow, who kept the Thistlewood Inn, had left a basket of late apples at her kitchen door only that Sunday with no note attached, as though a debt of quiet kindness, once large enough, required no explanation between people who understood each other. She had built all of it without once imagining that anyone from London would come to see it. "Thank you, Mr. Fenn," she said. "You've done well to bring me this directly." He hesitated at the door, hat still in his hands, and she recognized in him the particular loyalty of a man who had watched her work for a year and a half and had drawn his own conclusions about who deserved his allegiance, regardless of whose name sat above his wages. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but will there be trouble in it?" "For you?" She considered the honest answer and gave him a version of it. "I don't yet know what there will be. But I intend to be ready for whatever it is." She looked down at the ledger, at the neat, unimpeachable columns that represented 18 months of unwitnessed labor. "Ready is the one thing I know how to be." He left her to it. She sat a long while after the door had closed, listening to the particular quiet of the house at mid-morning, the accounts open before her and the solicitor's letter beside them, its wax seal broken and its contents already committed to memory. A discrepancy requiring explanation. His Grace to attend in person. Nothing more specific than that, which was, she was beginning to understand, its own kind of threat. A specific accusation could be answered. A vague one could be reshaped into whatever its author needed it to become. She thought again, unwillingly, of the box. It sat at the bottom of her wardrobe, beneath a folded shawl she never wore, exactly where it had sat since it arrived unannounced 18 months ago, the same week she had worked out later that she had first arrived at Thistlewood herself. A small locked correspondence box, sent north by a carrier who could not or would not say who had dispatched it, bearing no direction and no name, save for a single initial pressed into the wax of its seal. She had turned it over in her hands the day it arrived, had weighed it, had listened to the faint shift of papers inside it, and had then done the one thing that still struck her, 18 months later, as either the wisest or the most foolish decision of her marriage. She had not opened it. She had told herself, in the beginning, that she lacked the key, which was true. She had told herself, later, that whatever it contained could not matter to a woman who had never been permitted to matter to the people who might have written it. She had told herself, more recently, in the quiet hour before sleep when she permitted herself the fewest lies, that she was afraid, not of what the box might reveal about her husband, whom she had long since stopped expecting anything of, but of what it might reveal about the 18 months of careful, solitary competence she had built for herself in his absence. There was a particular safety in not knowing. She had built an entire life inside that safety, brick by ledger by cleared mortgage, and some undefended part of her understood that whatever slept inside that locked box had the power to take it all apart. She rose from the accounts table now and crossed to the wardrobe, and lifted the shawl, and looked down at the box she had refused to open for a year and a half. A fortnight, Fenn had said. The Duke, in person. Not a report. Not a solicitor's letter. The man himself, come north to see with his own eyes an estate he had written off as a liability and a wife he had written off along with it. She thought of the inventory record folded into the back of her own ledger, removed to town for the use of Mrs. Vivienne Colworth, and she thought of the box, and she understood, with the particular cold clarity that had carried her through every crisis her father had ever survived, that these two objects were connected in some way she had not yet permitted herself to trace to its end. That the silence of 18 months had not been indifference so much as absence of opportunity, and that opportunity, whatever shape it took, was arriving at her door within a fortnight, whether she was ready to meet it or not. She did not open the box that morning. She knelt before it a long moment, her ink-stained fingers resting on its locked lid, and then she rose, and closed the wardrobe, and went back to the accounts table, because the accounts were due, and because there were now exactly 14 days before the man who had sent her north with 3 sentences and a banker's draft would stand once more in front of her, and she intended, when that day came, to be holding nothing but the truth, in her own hand, dated and witnessed and beyond anyone's power to dispute. She did not yet know that the box in her wardrobe held the one truth her ledgers could not. He arrived on the 11th day, 3 days earlier than Fenn's information had promised, in a carriage that raised more dust than ceremony, and Cordelia knew it was him before she saw the crest, because no one else in the county owned for matched greys and no reason to hurry them. She was in the granary when the carriage passed on the upper road, counting sacks against the ledger with the steward's boy at her elbow, and she finished the count before she went to meet him, because the count was not yet finished, and because there was a particular value, she had learned, in not appearing to have been waiting. The Duke of Wexmoor had expected, she understood later from the set of his face in that first hour, to find something closer to wreckage. A woman thinned by neglect. Fields gone to weed for want of a competent hand. A house drawing down toward the same slow ruin that had swallowed a dozen secondary estates before it, quietly, without anyone in London troubling to notice until the creditors did. He had written Thistlewood off 18 months ago the way a man writes off a debt he does not expect to collect, and he had, by every account Cordelia could piece together afterward, genuinely believed he would find that expectation confirmed. He found instead a granary full to the rafters. He found tenant cottages with new thatch and swept doorsteps, chimneys drawing smoke into a clean autumn sky, children who did not scatter at the sight of a ducal carriage but stood watching it with open, unafraid curiosity, because a carriage on this road had come to mean, in recent memory, nothing more alarming than the land agent's monthly visit. He found, when he stepped down at last onto the gravel forecourt, a household staff that greeted him with correct and entirely unforced deference, and a housekeeper who addressed her mistress not as a courtesy but as a fact, the way one speaks of a person whose authority has never once been in question. He found, in short, a wife he did not recognize, running an estate he did not recognize, and Cordelia watched him absorb this from a distance of perhaps 20 feet, and permitted herself no expression at all while she did it. "Your Grace," she said, when he had crossed the forecourt to where she stood. "You've come earlier than we were told to expect you." "I find early arrivals reveal more than announced ones." His eyes moved once, briefly, past her shoulder to the granary doors standing open behind her, the sacks stacked in their orderly rows, and something crossed his face that she could not yet name, because she had not seen it on him before. "You look well, Cordelia." "I am well." She did not return the observation, though she noted, in the same clinical part of her mind that kept the ledgers, that he did not look well, that there was a tiredness in him that 18 months had carved rather than aged, and a stillness that was not quite the composure she remembered from her wedding day but something nearer to a man holding a great deal very carefully in both hands. "You'll want to see the house." "I want to see the accounts." It was said without preamble, without the courtesy of arriving first at some gentler subject, and she understood it for what it was, not rudeness, but urgency badly disguised as directness. A man who had ridden 4 days into the country because a solicitor's letter had told him something he could not make sense of from London, and who intended to make sense of it now, in person, before he permitted himself to feel anything else about what he was seeing. "They're ready," she said. "They have been ready since the letter arrived." She led him not to a drawing-room, which Thistlewood possessed but rarely used, but to the estate office, where the ledgers lived in their proper order on shelves she had built herself, out of salvaged oak, in her 2nd month at the house. She set the current year's accounts before him, and beside them the 3 years prior, and beside those the tenant agreements, the wool contracts with all 3 buyers' seals affixed, the receipts for the sale of the hunting lodge, the discharged mortgage with its final payment dated and witnessed by Fenn's own hand. Saturday. He did not remove his gloves at first, and she watched him realize this somewhere around the 2nd column of figures and strip them off with the particular impatience of a man annoyed at his own inattention. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not entirely hostile either. It was the silence of a man reading numbers that refused to resolve into the story he had expected them to tell. "This cannot be correct," he said, some while later, and it was not an accusation so much as a request that she contradict him. "Which figure, Your Grace?" "The net." He turned the ledger a quarter turn toward her, as though she might not already know precisely what it contained. "This cannot be the net for a single year. It is the net for the year just closed. The prior year's is beside it, should you wish to confirm the trend was not an accident." He looked at the prior year. He looked at the year before that, in which the figure was considerably smaller, though still, she noted with some private satisfaction, in credit rather than debt, because she had begun turning the estate before she had fully understood how badly it had needed turning. He set the 3 ledgers side by side and studied them the way a man studies a bridge he has just crossed, uncertain, after the fact, how it bore his weight. "The solicitor's assessment," he said slowly, compared Thistlewood's revenues against the other Wexmoor holdings, including the London house. "I assumed that was the nature of a tax assessment, yes. Thistlewood returns more than the London house." He said it the way a man says a sum aloud to confirm he has not misread it. "More than the London house, Cordelia. This year and the year before." She said nothing to this, because there was nothing accurate to add to it, and because she had learned, across 18 months of solitary decision-making, that the most persuasive answer to a difficult truth was frequently silence held at the correct length. He was quiet himself for a long moment. She watched his hands, which had gone still on the ledger's open page, the fingers spread slightly as though bracing against the desk rather than resting on it, and she thought, not for the first time since he had stepped down from the carriage, that she was watching a man do arithmetic that had nothing to do with the figures in front of him. "You did all of this," he said finally, "without writing to tell me." You did not ask. No, the word came out low, almost private, as though he had not entirely intended her to hear it. I did not ask. He looked up from the ledger, and for the first time since his arrival, something in his face was unguarded, not warmth, not yet, but the particular rawness of a man confronting the size of an oversight he had spent a year and a half not permitting himself to examine. I sent you here with a draft and 3 sentences, and I did not think of you again beyond the quarter days, and you built this. Alone. I had Fen. I had the tenants. I was not entirely alone. That is not what I meant, and you know it is not what I meant. She did know it, and she allowed herself, briefly, the smallest satisfaction of having made him say it plainly rather than accepting the easier deflection she had offered him. She gathered the mortgage discharge and set it precisely atop the stack, squaring its edges though they required no squaring, because her hands wanted something to do that was not watching his face continue to come apart in that quiet, contained way. There is a discrepancy, the solicitor flagged, he said, recovering some of the formality he had arrived with, though it sat on him now less convincingly than it had an hour before. The sale of a hunting lodge. He could find no record of authorization. It required none. It was mine to sell, attached to the Thistlewood holding directly, not entailed, and forgotten long enough that your own solicitor's records had lost the deed before I found it in the estate archive. She met his eyes. I did not sell it to spite you, your grace, if that is the shape of your concern. I sold it because it was sitting empty and decaying and doing no one any good, and the mortgage was doing considerable harm. That is not the shape of my concern. He looked back down at the ledger, though she suspected he was no longer reading it. My concern is that I have spent 18 months believing this estate was a liability I had been generous enough to still support, when in fact it has been the only holding in the portfolio that did not require my attention to thrive. A pause, and then, quieter, I am trying to determine what that says about the holdings that did have my attention. She did not ask him what he meant by that, though the question sat close under her tongue, and she noticed, filed the observation the way she filed everything, precisely, for later use, that he had not elaborated further either, had let the sentence trail into something adjacent to a confession without finishing it. It was the housekeeper, arriving with tea neither of them had requested, who broke the moment with news that had nothing to do with the ledgers at all. Begging pardon, your grace, my lady, she said, setting the tray down with the particular care of a woman who has sensed, correctly, that she is interrupting something. A letter came for you this morning, your grace, forwarded on from town. Your man there said to tell you Mrs. Colworth's household has been sending for the jewellers rather often of late. He thought you'd want it mentioned, given you were travelling. It was said as idle service, a courtesy passed along without any particular weight attached to it, and the housekeeper withdrew again before either of them could ask her to clarify what rather often meant, or which jewellers, or to what end. Cordelia watched the Duke's face for a reaction and found, to her mild surprise, that there was almost none, a brief furrow, quickly smoothed, the response of a man too occupied with the reckoning already in front of him to spare much attention for a domestic errand 3 counties away. But she noted it. She noted it the way she noted every unexplained figure in a column that did not yet balance, and set it aside in the part of her mind reserved for facts that had not yet found their place. He stayed with the ledgers past the point where the light through the office window had gone long and amber, past the point where the tea had cooled untouched in its pot, reading and rereading columns he had already confirmed twice, as though the act of reading them again might produce a different, more comfortable conclusion. It did not. She watched him understand, slowly and without saying so aloud again, that the wife he had dismissed to a crumbling house with a letter of 4 sentences had built, unwitnessed and unthanked, the most solvent thing he owned. When he finally closed the last ledger and set his hand flat upon its cover, he did not look at her immediately. I had intended, he said, to stay 1 night. To confirm the assessment and return to London. And now? Now I find I do not understand this estate at all, and I find that troubles me more than I expected it to. He looked up at her then, and the formality had gone out of his voice entirely, replaced by something more uncertain, more genuinely asking than any request he had made of her since the wedding. "I would like to stay a few days. To understand it properly." To understand, he stopped himself before the sentence went further than the ledgers, and she noted that too. "To understand the accounts in full, before I return." It was not the request she had expected from him, not in the first hour of a reunion she had spent 18 months preparing for and had still, apparently, not prepared for correctly. She looked at him a moment, at the tired stillness of him, at the hands that had gone quiet on the ledger's cover, and she thought of the box beneath the shawl in her wardrobe, and the jewellers 3 counties away, and the sentence he had not finished. "You may stay as long as you require, Your Grace," she said, and did not tell him that she did not, yet, believe a word of what his staying might mean. He was gone 4 days, called back to London by a matter the solicitor's letter had described only as requiring his Grace's personal attention, and Cordelia did not ask what the matter was, because she had learned, across 4 days of his absence, that she did not entirely trust herself to hear the answer without her face reporting something she preferred to keep private. The appraisal itself was, by every account she pieced together afterward, meant to be a formality. Anthony had gone to the jeweller not out of suspicion but out of the ordinary tidiness of a man closing out a set of accounts. The Ashby diamonds had not been formally valued in 11 years, and a man who had just spent 4 days discovering how badly he had misjudged one set of figures develops, for a while at least, a fresh appetite for confirming the rest. He had sent the stones ahead by his own man rather than escorting Mrs. Colworth to the appointment herself, a small procedural courtesy that would later strike him, Cordelia imagined, as the only fortunate decision he made that week. The jeweller's report was 2 lines long. The Ashby diamonds, the principal stones of the pearl the Duke's mother had worn at her own wedding and every duchess before her, were paste. Good paste, skillfully set, convincing enough to pass a casual glance across a ballroom for a year or more, but paste all the same, and beneath the settings, where a careful eye might look for the maker's original mounting marks, the jeweller had found instead the fresher, less practiced hand of a man who did such work quietly, for people who preferred their business unremarked upon. Cordelia did not witness what followed. She had it later, in careful pieces, from Fenn, who had it from a groom, who had it from a footman who had been in the townhouse hall when the shouting, brief, controlled, more terrible for its control than any shouting would have been, passed between the Duke's study and the rooms Mrs. Colworth occupied. What was not disputed, by the time the account reached Cordelia whole, was this, that Vivienne Colworth had been selling the Ashby diamonds, stone by stone, for the better part of a year, replacing each as it went with paste cut to match, and banking the proceeds in a London counting house under a name that was not quite her own. Miss V. E. Colworth had become, in the ledgers of a discreet and incurious bank, a Mrs. Vera Coleridge, a widow of independent means, whose deposits had grown steadily, unremarkably, for 11 months. What was also not disputed was what she said when the accusation was laid before her plainly, with the jeweller's report on the desk between them and no room left for softer explanations. She did not deny it outright. She was, by every account, too intelligent a woman for so simple a defense. Instead, she turned the accusation, gently, almost sorrowfully, back toward the north. A woman handed nothing but debts, she was reported to have said, does not simply produce a fortune from nothing, Anthony. Not honestly. I have heard what Thistlewood returns now, more than this house, they tell me. Ask yourself where such a sum comes from, truly, before you decide whose word to doubt. She had wept a little, Cordelia understood, at the appropriate moment in the telling, and had reminded him, in the particular soft voice a woman uses when she has spent years learning exactly how a man prefers to be reminded of things, that she had never once asked him for more than his company, that whatever comfort she had offered him across a decade of loneliness had cost him nothing he had not given freely, and that it seemed a strange repayment now to believe a stranger's ledgers over a familiar heart. It was, Cordelia thought later, when she had the whole account and time enough to consider it properly, a remarkably efficient piece of construction. It did not deny the paste. It could not, the jeweller's report made denial impossible. It instead built, Out of the very fact of Thistlewood's improbable success, a second crime to sit beside the first, implied, unspecific, and for that reason nearly impossible to answer directly, because how does one prove the negative of an accusation that names no particular theft, no particular ledger, no particular hour? Anthony came north again 3 days later, and Cordelia knew before he had crossed the forecourt that whatever had happened in London had not resolved cleanly, because he did not come to find her in the granary or the estate office, where she would ordinarily have been at that hour. He came to the house itself and asked the housekeeper where his wife might be found, in a voice the housekeeper described afterward as careful in a way that unsettled her more than anger would have. He found her in the still room, where she was cataloguing the last of the autumn remedies before the frost took the garden entirely, and he stood in the doorway a moment before he spoke, and she understood, from that single hesitation, that he had come to ask her something he did not want to ask and did not know how to ask kindly. "I need to put a question to you," he said. "And I need you to understand that I am asking it, not accusing you of it. There is a difference, and I am trying very hard to hold to it." She set down the jar in her hands with the same deliberate care she brought to setting down anything she did not wish to drop, and turned to face him fully. "Then ask it plainly, Your Grace. I would rather have the question than watch you circle it." He told her, then, of the paste, and the appraisal, and the bank in London, and Vivienne Colworth's account of where such easy suspicion might more properly settle Thistlewood's improbable fortune. A wife handed nothing but debts who had somehow produced, within 18 months, more wealth than the house that had wanted for nothing. He did not accuse her outright, not once, across the whole of the telling. That, she understood even as she listened, was precisely what wounded her, that he had come not with an accusation, which she could have met with the flat contempt it deserved, but with a genuine, unresolved uncertainty, standing in her still room with his hands loose at his sides, asking her, in effect, to prove she was not what another woman had merely suggested she might be. She was quiet a long moment after he finished. Not because she lacked an answer, but because she wanted him to feel, fully, the weight of the silence he had walked into her house to create. "Come with me," she said at last, and led him not to the estate office this time, but to the granary, and from the granary to the tenant cottages, and from the cottages to the mill where the wool was weighed and recorded before it ever left Thistlewood land. She did not raise her voice once across the whole of it. She showed him the wool contracts, 3 buyers' seals upon them, each dated and witnessed by Fenn's hand and countersigned by the buyers themselves, men whose direction she gave him freely, should he wish to write to any of them and ask, in his own words, whether the transactions were genuine. She showed him the tenant ledgers, 23 families' names in her own small, exacting hand, their rents recorded quarter by quarter across 18 months, alongside the receipts each family had signed themselves, not her signature standing in for theirs, but their own marks, their own names, proof that required no trust in her at all, only trust in 23 separate people who had no reason to lie on her behalf and every reason, had the money been extracted from them dishonestly, to say so. She showed him the discharged mortgage, and beside it the sale record for the hunting lodge, witnessed by the very solicitor's clerk whose master had first raised the question in London, a fact she allowed to sit in the silence a moment before continuing, so that he might understand fully that the man questioning her honesty in one letter had, months earlier and without knowing it, already certified it in another. She showed him the still room's accounts, every remedy given away recorded not for profit, since none was taken, but out of the same habit of precision that governed everything else she touched, proof, if he required it, that even her charity had been conducted in the open, witnessed by the very village that had, in turn, left baskets at her door with no note attached, because a debt of kindness large enough required no explanation between people who understood each other. "There is no gap in any of this," she said finally, when the accounting was complete and they stood once more in the estate office where the whole reckoning had begun 11 days before. "No figure without a witness. No transaction without a second signature. I built this estate in the open, Your Grace, in full view of every tenant, every buyer, every clerk who touched it, precisely because I understood from the first week that a woman in my position would one day be asked to defend what she had built, and I did not intend to be caught without an answer." She met his eyes directly. Mrs. Colworth's accusation requires you to believe that 23 families, 3 independent wool buyers, a land agent, and your own solicitor's clerk have each separately chosen to lie for my benefit. Mine requires you to believe 18 months of dated, witnessed record. I will leave it to you to decide which is the more probable conspiracy." He did not answer her at once. He stood with the ledgers open before him, the same columns he had already confirmed twice on his first visit, and she watched something in his face come apart entirely, not the contained, careful unraveling she had seen in him before, but something rawer, closer to the surface, the look of a man who has just understood, fully and without the comfort of ambiguity, the precise shape of what he nearly allowed himself to believe. "I let her plant the doubt," he said quietly, "before I had even finished reading your figures the first time. I sat in this room and watched you build a fortune out of nothing I gave you, and 4 days later I let a woman who has never once opened a ledger in her life convince me to ride north and ask you to prove yourself innocent of a theft that exists nowhere but in the fact that I neglected you well enough to make it plausible." "Yes," Cordelia said, because there was no gentler true thing to say in its place, and she had never once, in 18 months, found comfort in a kind lie. He was silent a long while, his hand resting flat on the cover of the ledger, and when he finally looked up at her, the formality that had carried him through every conversation since his arrival was entirely gone, replaced by something she had not yet seen on him and did not yet know how to name. "I have spent this whole visit discovering how thoroughly I misjudged one woman," he said. "I begin to understand tonight that I misjudged a second, in the opposite direction, for considerably longer. The formal reckoning was held not in London, where scandal could be neither contained nor controlled, but in the estate office at Thistlewood, at Cordelia's own insistence, on the grounds that a theft committed against the Wexmoor holdings ought to be settled on Wexmoor land, in the presence of the people who had done the work of proving it. There were 5 persons present when Mrs. Vivienne Colworth was brought north, a journey she had not wished to make and had been given, in the end, no genuine choice about. The solicitor sat at the head of the table with the particular discomfort of a man who does not enjoy correcting his own earlier errors. Mr. Fenn sat beside him, hands folded, his testimony already given and already unshakable. A magistrate from the county sat at the far end, invited by the Duke himself, present to lend the proceeding a weight that a private conversation could not carry, though Cordelia understood, from the moment his name was proposed, that his presence was meant less to threaten Mrs. Colworth than to demonstrate, to anyone who later asked, that the matter had been handled properly rather than buried. And Mrs. Ivy Hallow, of all people, had been asked to attend as well, at Cordelia's own request, not for any legal necessity, but because a woman who had spent 18 months quietly witnessing the truth of Thistlewood's rebuilding deserved to see, in person, the moment that truth was finally acknowledged by the one household that had refused to notice it. Mrs. Colworth entered the room in the particular composure of a woman who has decided, having lost the argument in principle, to at least win it in bearing. She was, Cordelia noted without any particular satisfaction in the noting, still beautiful in the practiced way that beauty becomes a tool rather than a fact, and she looked at no one in the room longer than she looked at Anthony, as though the outcome of the whole proceeding still depended, in some part of her, on what remained of his old fondness. The solicitor laid out the accounting without embellishment, because the figures required none. The bank records under the name Vera Coleridge. The dates matched precisely against the jeweller's estimate of when each stone had likely been replaced. The total, a considerable sum, though Cordelia noted, and later said aloud, that it was not so large a sum as to be beyond a woman's capacity to repay, which was, she understood even as she made the observation, precisely the point she intended to make. Mrs. Colworth did not deny the figures. She had learned, evidently, in the days since the confrontation in London, that denial served her poorly against a man with a jeweller's report in hand. What she offered instead, when at last invited to speak, was an accounting of her own 11 years of loyalty, of comfort given without complaint, of a debt owed her by a man who had allowed her to believe, across a decade, that her position was more permanent than a mistress's position had any right to be. It was not, Cordelia thought, listening to it unfold, an entirely dishonest defence. It was simply incomplete, the way most defences were, true in its particulars and false in the conclusion it wished those particulars to support. It was the magistrate who asked, eventually, what disposition the Duke intended to seek, and it was here that Cordelia spoke for the first time since the proceeding had opened. "I would ask, Your Grace, that the matter be settled through repayment rather than prosecution." She said it plainly, to the room rather than to him alone, so that there might be no appearance of a private understanding negotiated out of anyone's hearing. "Mrs. Colworther's banked funds are sufficient to restore the value of the stones taken, in full, without recourse to the courts. I would ask further that she be quietly released from the protection of this household, with no further claim upon it, and that the matter go no further than this room." The solicitor looked faintly startled by this, as solicitors generally did when offered mercy in place of the fuller reckoning the law made available to them. "You would forego prosecution, my lady? After a theft of this magnitude?" "I would forego public ruin," Cordelia said. "Not accountability. She will repay what was taken, in full, and she will leave this family's protection, and both of those things will be true whether or not a magistrate's court is troubled with the particulars. A scandal serves no one in this room, least of all the tenants and buyers and clerks whose names are attached to records that have nothing to do with this matter and every right to remain untouched by it." She looked, briefly, at Mrs. Colworth, whose composure had, for the first time in the proceeding, genuinely faltered. "I have spent 18 months learning the difference between punishment and justice. I find I prefer the latter, where it can be had." Anthony said little across the whole of the reckoning, and Cordelia understood, watching him, that his silence was not indifference but the particular stillness of a man conducting an accounting of his own that had nothing to do with bank records or jewellers' reports. When he did speak, near the proceedings' close, it was not to Mrs. Colworth at all, but to the room generally, in the flat, unadorned voice of a man setting down a weight he has carried long enough to recognize its exact shape. "I gave a woman I had known 11 years my trust without once earning it through attention," he said, "and I gave a woman I had married 18 months without once earning it through presence. I do not think either failure excuses the other. I think, examined honestly, they are the same failure, worn two different ways." He looked, then, fully at Cordelia, and there was nothing performed in it. "I have no defense to offer for either. I would rather spend what remains of my time correcting the second than explaining the first." The terms were settled before the afternoon was out. Mrs. Colworther's repayment was arranged through the solicitor, her removal from the townhouse conducted with a discretion that would leave, Cordelia privately suspected, considerably less gossip in London than the theft itself might have generated had it become known, which was, after all, the entire point. The magistrate departed satisfied that propriety had been observed. Mrs. Hallow departed, Cordelia learned later, and told the story for years afterward to anyone who would listen, though always, out of some instinct for the family's dignity, leaving out the particular names. It was evening before Anthony came to find her again, in the estate office, where she had returned, as she always returned, to the ledgers, because the day's accounts were not yet closed and closing them was the one thing she still knew how to do without hesitation. He did not sit across from her this time. He stood near the window, where the last of the light was going long and amber across the shelves she had built with her own hands in her second month at Thistlewood, and he was quiet long enough that she set down her pen and gave him her full attention, because she had learned, across the length of this visit, that his silences generally preceded something he had rehearsed and still did not trust himself to say plainly. "I am not going to ask you to forgive me," he said at last. "I don't believe it's mine to ask for, not yet, and perhaps not for some while. What I would ask instead," he stopped, started again, in the manner of a man who has discarded several more practiced versions of a sentence and is left with only the plain one. "I would ask for a place in the work you've built here. Not command of it. Not my name over yours in the ledgers. I have done nothing yet to earn either. I am asking only to be permitted to learn what you already understand about this estate, and about attention, and about what it costs to build something honestly rather than simply inherit it and call the inheriting enough." It was not the proposal she might once have imagined, in the early bitter months when she had still permitted herself to imagine anything from him at all. There was no grand declaration in it, no promise dressed up larger than the man making it could yet be certain of keeping. It was, she understood, precisely the sort of request a man made when he had finally learned the difference between wanting to be forgiven and wanting to be useful, and she found, examining her own reaction with the same unhurried precision she brought to every column of figures that had ever crossed her table, that the second was considerably harder to refuse than the first would have been. She did not answer him immediately. She let the silence hold the length it required, because she had learned, across 18 months of solitary decision-making, that the answers worth trusting were rarely the ones that arrived quickly. "I will consider it," she said finally, "on one condition. You will stay the full turning of a year, not as a guest, not riding back to London the moment the London house requires your attention, but here, learning the accounts properly, earning whatever place you're asking for the same way I earned mine. And at the end of that year, you may ask me again what you've asked me tonight, and I will answer you honestly, whatever the answer turns out to be." She met his eyes. "I will not be rushed into trusting you simply because the alternative is lonelier. I built this estate without being rushed into anything. I do not intend to abandon the habit now." "A year," he said, and something in his face, not quite the smile she suspected he was still learning how to make honestly, but the beginning of one, suggested he had expected a harder condition and was relieved, however cautiously, to find this one within his reach. "I can hold to a year." "See that you do," she said, and returned to her ledger, because the day's accounts were not yet closed, and there was, she found, a particular comfort in returning to the one thing that had never once required her to wonder whether it could be trusted. That night, when the house had gone quiet and the last of the ink had dried on her second finger in the manner it always did, Cordelia climbed the stairs to her room and opened the wardrobe, and lifted the shawl she never wore, and looked down, for the first time in 18 months, at the small locked correspondence box that had sat beneath it since the week she first arrived at Thistlewood. She did not send for a locksmith. She found, instead, in the bottom of her own writing desk, a key she had kept without quite admitting to herself why she had kept it, sent, she understood now, in the same parcel as the box itself, 18 months ago, by a sender who had never signed a name, only a single initial pressed into wax. She fitted it to the lock, and it turned, and inside, beneath a scattering of old correspondence that meant nothing to her at all, she found a single folded letter, addressed not to the Duke, and not to Mrs. Colworth's own hand, but to the next Duchess of Wexmoor, whoever she may be, written, she understood as she read it, by the Duke's own mother, 11 years dead, who had apparently once suspected precisely the arrangement her son would one day make, and had left, in case it ever came to pass, a single piece of counsel for the woman who inherited the difficulty of it: build something of your own that cannot be taken from you, and let the rest of them come to understand its value in their own time, or not at all. Cordelia read it twice, the way she read everything that mattered, and then she folded it once, precisely, and set it not back in the box, but into the accounts book beside the inventory record she had kept instead of burned 18 months before, 2 documents, now, that told the same story from opposite ends, both finally answered. If this story found its way past your defenses tonight, if you sat forward when the jeweller's report landed, or held your breath through the reckoning in that small estate office, then you already understand the kind of fire we keep burning here. This is where the overlooked build their own fortunes, quietly, and are seen at last for exactly what they built. I would love to know which moment stayed with you longest, the paste diamonds, or the year she asked him to earn. Tell me in the comments. And if you'd like a chair kept warm here for the next one, a subscription is simply your way of saying you'll be back. Until then, keep your own ledgers honest, and may the truth in them always find you first.
Subscribe for more interesting Duke-related stories.